Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special evening. I'm Karen Lowe, Director of East Village and Special Projects for the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. GVSHP is a nonprofit founded in 1980 to preserve the architectural and cultural history of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We are very grateful to our supporters and trustees, some of whom I see in the audience. It's wonderful to have you here. And we encourage you all to become supporters too. There are brochures on the tables in the lobby. Thanks to our co-sponsor, the New School, and especially Pam Tillis, for bringing us to this lovely space tonight and allowing us to enjoy a performance by the students' Ornette Coleman Ensemble, conducted by Jane Ira Bloom, who was just named Soprano Saxophonist of the Year by the Jazz Journalists Association. And Howard Mandel here is the president of the Jazz Journalists Association, but we'll get back to that. Tonight we get to talk about two fascinating subjects, the trailblazing saxophonist Ornette Coleman and the quintessential jazz club, the Five Spot Café. This month was designated as the first ever Lower East Side History Month, which gave my organization, along with many others, new inspiration to explore the incredible richness of our neighborhoods. I was excited to discover that the Five Spot Café used to be not far from here, on the northernmost Bowery at East 5th Street, then at St. Mark's Place. I've known the club mostly from a favorite album, Eric Dolphy at the Five Spot, which was recorded there one night in July of 1961. The music smokes, and even the background sounds of the audience are magical somehow. While researching the club, I came upon David Lee's book, The Battle of the Five Spot, which skillfully analyzes a high point in the lives of both the place and of Ornette Coleman himself. Coleman, by the way, is another favorite of mine, ever since I published a poem about his piece, Lonely Woman, in my high school literary magazine. The poem is best forgotten, but the composition is not, and we'll hear an interpretation of it later from the ensemble. Coleman has lived in Manhattan for decades, still a part of the New York field that he disrupted 55 years ago. David's book enlightens us about sociological ideas like the field, positions, position takers, and more. Hopefully any sociologists present tonight will forgive us for using those terms interchangeably with everyday ones like the scene, the hierarchy, and paying your dues. In any case, we'll talk about the jazz scene then and now, and that's what we're all interested in. So without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. Directly on my left is David Lee, here tonight from Hamilton, Ontario, where he writes and plays the bass and cello. His book, The Battle of the Five Spot, was first published in 2006 and has been reissued just in time to sell it here tonight. Took a little bit of arm twisting, I hear. Stacy Dillard, next to David, is a saxophonist and composer who lives in Brooklyn and originally hails from Michigan. Stacy plays various styles in various venues. Thus, he has a multifaceted view into the New York field of today. And Howard Mandel, on the end, is a critic who is president of the Jazz Journalists Association. He's published 2 books, including one called Miles Ornette Cecil, Jazz Beyond Jazz, and he writes about jazz for all the major publications. Howard is out in the clubs frequently to hear new music and also has a great feel for the local scene. So again, we're delighted that you all are here. And I think we'll start.
If you insist.
Okay. We're going to start just to get things going with a lightning round and see what each of our panelists has to say in a word or a sentence about Ornette Coleman. David.
Western.
Enlightened.
Humanist.
Very nice. Western, enlightened, and humanist. And how about Five Spot?
Wish I'd been there.
Wish I'd been there too.
Dank.
Sweet. And how about downtown, the real or mythic downtown, as the center of jazz performance and appreciation?
Ain't what it used to be.
But it's still happening.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. All right. Let's hear it for Canada. Canada's in the house. So Terrific. Those are a few thoughts for us to start with. And we're going to ask David to give a brief overview of the thesis of his book, What Was the New York Field and the Battle of the Five Spot? And I'm going to give a plug because this is a terrific book. It is short and well written. What more can you ask for? But very enlightening and just interesting. And even as a longtime jazz fan, I learned so much about the music. So, David, tell us what's going on in your book.
Well, what's going on? Well,
Into the mic.
let me just say, some years ago, I did a master's in music criticism at McMaster University in Canada, and I went into it thinking I would write my thesis on improvisation as a religious experience. And I was thinking of musicians such as Albert Ayler, and of course Coltrane, who are overtly devotional in what they were doing and stated it and talked about it. But I was, of course, in a university, in an academic course, and I went back to the roots of Western musical criticism. And I started to ask why we even say necessarily that music has to be lofty and spiritual, and what were the values being put on that, because you have to unpack all this stuff when you're in academia. And then I started to think about, I had done a lot of work with Paul Bley, a contemporary of Ornette Coleman some years before. And Paul, whatever else you can say about him, has some very interesting takes on the jazz scene as a workshop, as an educational institute.
A pianist, by the way.
Yes. As a place where the players are constantly teaching and learning from each other and analyzing what they're doing and exercising a critical faculty in what they're doing. And in fact, critical faculty was sort of took me to another level. Okay, so if it's spiritual, does that mean it's uncritical? I don't think so.
Not necessarily.
No, not necessarily, not by any means. So I kind of started to go into those questions, and it was about critical theory and music criticism, the whole program. And I started to think what would really interest me to write about. And of course, it's quite different in the States, I'm sure, but if you go into Canadian institutions and talk about this stuff, nobody knows anything about jazz. So if you go in as a student and know something about jazz, you've got a huge advantage. So I decided to write about Ornette Coleman and about the weight that was put on his music, and about how even in histories now, his debut and that music is depicted as something very revolutionary that really shook up the music scene at that time. But then I thought, well, wait a second, Cecil Taylor was working then too, in some very interesting areas. In fact, everyone was doing something that contributed to this focus of attention that came on the Coleman Quartet at the Five Spot Café. So I thought, why is it seen as being so revolutionary? I mean, when I was introduced to jazz, I sort of was taught about Charlie Parker, and then I thought, right, Parker, I can hear that, yeah, and I thought Ornette Coleman, right, that's like Charlie Parker too, except without the piano, and but it sounded the same to me, right? So I thought, why was it so revolutionary?
And?
Well, I still haven't really concluded that.
Anyone? Just kidding. So that's an open question. Howard, do you want to take a stab why it was so revolutionary?
I think that David has obscured some of the great points of his book, which is really the sociology and this is not a book of theory. It's really a description, very clear and vivid, of what was going on in the club scene in 1959. And how people were in and out of those clubs for their own entertainment. And we tend to forget today, how many, the jazz was an entertainment option. and a very sophisticated one, but that people wanted to get out of their little New York apartments then, as they do now, and to go to the third place, to, not home, not work, to go to a club for a social experience, to have an aesthetic experience too, was very exciting, and it was quite normal. I mean, that was what people did. And I remember hearing Gunther Schuller talk about how he would get off the subway at 42nd Street, and he and his wife would have a beer at every club playing music up until 57th, and they'd be wasted by the time they got up there. And this was a typical night out. Now, David and I think, are both too young to have gotten to New York in the 50s, right? We weren't here. You weren't here. A little bit, yeah. And so, there are probably some people in the audience who had that experience. But even when I was beginning to do the jazz scene in New York in the 80s, that was very common. We would go out for the evening. I'd hit 3 or 4 places and sometimes see the same musicians at those different places at different hours, traveling around. And it was very social. That was why I was going out. And so the kinds of hierarchies and power relationships that David writes about in the book are like a movie to me. I mean, it's very exciting to see, here's Leonard Bernstein, sitting over there, and there's Miles coming in, and you can just depict these characters. I mean, imagine them. And that's the great thing about your book. It reads like a novella that way, and has, for the jazz fan also, this information about how Ornette's music was shaking people up. And myself, having read probably the first accounts of this in Thomas Pynchon's novel V, where he has a character McClintock Spade, who's Ornette, and he describes the quartet. I mean, I was all primed to read a nonfiction version of this when I got your book.
Let's see. I'll try to also summarize the vivid picture that David paints of a scene. The Five Spot was very well patronized, very popular. It was run by Joe and Iggy Termini, and it seems like they were terrific hosts, really. They were good at having a good mix of people, of artists, of enthusiasts, of sort of voyeurs or dilettantes, and the best players around. And it was a place that was, I guess, the top of the hierarchy, where the finest players played, and where this newcomer from the West appeared. And with the blessing of certain influential critics, with Atlantic Records backing him, and so he had, in sociological terms, he had been consecrated by some powerful folks, but was his actual playing was not in the mainstream. And let's talk about today, stylistically. Can a player appear and make a splash stylistically? 55 years later, with all the jazz that's happened, with all the pop culture, sometimes it seems like there cannot be anything new under the sun. Stacy, how about it? Can a player get the kind of backlash that Ornette did?
Yeah.
That is to say, a good player who could play his instrument.
I remember upon arriving on the scene about almost 12 years ago, myself, I came here unannounced. I didn't go to any of the major schools, anything like that. I didn't go to any of the major jazz camps.
And like Ornette, you had never even been to New York before.
Right.
Before he moved here.
I just moved here. I never visited. I just moved. Anyway, 2 suitcases, 2 horns. That was that. And you're really just one person away from the next step or the next 3 steps. Because imagine if any of you, did your craft in front of somebody with media power like an Oprah Winfrey or somebody like that. I want to put you on my show. And if you get on their show, everybody's going to know. And then, you're going to reap from that. But then you're going to have your people that's going to say, well, he hasn't been around enough. He hasn't been around enough, and this, that, and the other. But that really doesn't matter. What matters is you can execute, if you can express, if you can, you know, if you can play the art form. Because that kind of happened to me. I was sitting in at Cleopatra's Needle around that time ago, about 10, 11 years ago. And I didn't know who was in the audience, you know. But I always had it in my mind and my heart to just really play. Like every time you play, I don't care if it's one person out there, I don't care if it's nobody out there. You know, it's going to be true expression all times. And it kind of paid off for me because, you know, Eric Reed, pianist, great pianist, was sitting back there. That was like one of my first like big gigs in New York. You know, I did a week at the Vanguard with him, played at Dizzy's a couple times, so I was like, oh goodness, you know. And, you know, I won't say any names, but some of my contemporaries, you know, had some things to say about that, and word got back to me, and it was cool, you know. I understand human nature a little bit, and that's okay. So, yeah, one can come in, and it's not about doing something new for the sake of doing something new, because you'll find yourself being untrue a lot because you're trying to, you know, you're devoting your energies to a certain aspect as to diving into the entire aspect, which is just playing the music, playing the way you feel it, you know, the way it is, the way it comes from you. So yeah, it's very possible because I think I, for one, I'm one of the, I mean, I haven't invented any, I didn't not nearly made a splash as anywhere close as Ornette Coleman, because, you know, probably none of you know who I am anyway. So, so you know, that's that. But to be able to come in new, and it was, I would say I was fresh because I hadn't been to the camps, I hadn't been to the major schools, and I hadn't been listening to the same people saying, this is what you need to do, and you need to do it this way, you need to do it this way. I kind of took my own path, but you know, it's led me in a good spot.
David, any thoughts on that from your own playing experience, as the bassist in an ensemble that is not always too mainstream, right?
I'm kind of writing about that sort of thing now because I'm writing about actually Canadian improvised music and finding that it was introduced to Canada in the 60s. The people who were really turned on by Ornette Coleman when he appeared on the scene up in, say, Toronto, were actually abstract expressionist painters. And so the first improvising band in Canada was the Artist Jazz Band, who were all abstract expressionists. The jazz musicians universally turned their back on it. Pretty much. And I'm kind of investigating some of the same kind of questions. Jazz musicians already were trying to prove their legitimacy as jazz musicians, that their music could be accepted on the same level of any other music. So they didn't really need someone coming in and saying, well, you know, you can start from scratch. You can just start from the basics and build from that, and you don't need years of training and you don't need to exercise all the protocols. That was the last thing anyone wanted to hear, right? If you were a jazz musician who's already struggling to get your music on the air and into the institutions. So again, I'm kind of encountering the same sort of politics in looking at the Canadian scene that I wrote about in Five Spot.
Let's see which way to go. Oh, well, by the way, abstract expressionists, of course, patronized the Five Spot as well, Franz Klein and Willem de Kooning, and it was certainly a haven for the painters of the New York School in the 50s.
But Pollock liked traditional jazz.
Did he?
Yeah.
What?
He listened, I don't know exactly, but there are playlists of, but he was listening to 20s music. I don't know about de Kooning and, you know. But the thing that interested me about what Stacy said was that the backlash comes from the musicians, and I think in the case that he's citing, now maybe I'm wrong about this, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Stacy, but that for other musicians to see that you'd gotten a gig with Eric Reed, which was a desirable gig, that's where they were saying, who is this guy and where is he coming from? And the thing about Ornette was that he had a splash not only getting backlash from musicians who were on the scene, like Mingus and Roach and Roy Eldridge and people who didn't understand or didn't want that, but he made a huge splash with the public. And this was the public at the Five Spot. These were people who were, not trying to get gigs from the musicians, from each other, but they were out, again, for the entertainment and to be seen and to have the jazz experience. And this is what was, it seems like the breath of fresh air, or maybe the dash of cold water. It's like, what?
Right. They were hearing something they hadn't heard before, for the most part. A level of improvisation that was not the norm, and the lack of guitar and piano, a lot of horns. And so that was shocking. And you guys all go to a lot of clubs. Have you been shocked by anything you've heard lately? Can we be shocked in 2014?
I keep wanting
Musically?
to be shocked. There's stuff that surprises me, that amazes me, and then I'm thrilled when I hear it.
Tell us about that.
Well, I'm thinking of Tyshawn Sorey, who's an amazing drummer. And the first time I saw him, I went, oh my God, this guy. I mean, I've heard Elvin Jones, I've heard Max Roach, I've heard Ed Blackwell. This guy's got all of that. I cannot tell what he's going to do, but he's always doing the right thing. And he anticipates everything, and he's right where he should be. He's better than anybody could imagine that being. I say Cecile McLaurin-Salvant, this very fine singer. I began to hear some good reputation about her. I thought, well, okay, I'm very tough on singers. I was married to one. I don't know. So I went to hear her. I'm going to wait until I hear her live. As soon as she stepped on stage, really 2 notes, you just go, oh, she has it all. Yeah, and this is thrilling. And who could have thought? She's not singing avant-garde music particularly. In fact, she's singing a song from 1913, Nothing, one of the first vaudeville hits by a black artist, and she's killing it. And she's got some Sarah, and she's got some Ella, and she's got some Buddy Carter, but this is her. This is, that's great to discover somebody. It's fantastic.
And some of the people that Howard's mentioning, if you go to the Jazz Journalists Association website and look at their recent award winners, she was the Performer of the Year, Singer of the Year?
Up-and-coming Artist of the Year, and also
she's
Female
quite
Vocalist of the Year, with one record out. She's the only person who, in everybody's top 10 list, they put her record, Woman Child, on the list. And I mean, I turned my class at NYU onto her last semester, in spring semester. It doesn't, you don't have to be a jazz aficionado to feel excited by this great voice and this wonderful personality. I want to say also that I think that Ornette's personality was such different projection than what the jazz mythos was in 1959. Ornette is a very unusual person. He's very modest. He's very gentle, he's very soft-spoken, and he says the most incredible Zen koans that I've ever heard, and they just keep coming out. And, it's like he's not thinking about them, he's just giving you revelations all the time when you're talking to him in normal conversation. He's not working at it, and this must have been completely flummoxing to people steeped in the New York ethos, of sophistication and condescension and cynicism, and Ornette has none of that. And it must have just completely confused people.
A different kind of shock. David, did you want to say something about this? You looked like you did. I'll mention that there was a band that you mentioned to me, Howard, that I found shocking. Of course, there's good shock and bad shock. I guess you might just not like something. But you mentioned the band Organ Monk, which plays a lot of Thelonious Monk on the organ. And I confess, I'll need to listen to it some more. I might have been shocked.
I'm not sure there is that avant-garde fringe to jazz anymore. It seems to me if you play out far enough, there's a margin where you get shoved out to now. That's different from jazz per se. And of course, there's so much improvised musical discourse that I think can be credited as Ornette Coleman musical discourse, where people now feel they have the freedom to do just about anything. And there's been so much improvised music, which is starting from scratch in that sense. And there's been scratch music. And a lot of elements playing with overtones, extended techniques that were introduced during the 60s has been picked up since then as a point of departure by so many musicians who say, we're going to take these not as emotional extremes, but as simple technical elements, and we're going to build music off of them. There's so much been done. This could be a definition of postmodernism. I think perhaps no. I don't think you can really shock anyone anymore. People don't say, that's not jazz, or you shouldn't do that in jazz. They simply say, oh, there's a place for you. It is over there, but as long as you go over there, you'll be cool.
That's very true. Also, what people need to remember is that, with jazz music, it's a perfect reflection of who you are, what you do, what you don't do, what you say, what you don't say. Depending on how open-minded you are, as well as armed with intelligence about whatever it is you're doing, you're going to be able to delve into it more. Like Ornette, I got a chance to sit at his house and play with him for a few hours. And just, like Howard said, the things he would say, it's like, wow. I mean, it's so wide open, but when you think about it, it makes total sense. It goes beyond the box, the society box. You know what I mean? It's like all society is on this table. You can't do nothing outside this table. He's talking about all the stuff outside the table that clearly exists, and that's what opens your mind. And a lot of people, sad to say, aren't that way. So when they come to something that, if they don't like it, that means nobody should like it, instead of living and let live, that's the thing that tears down the music in the first place, to make it, people ask questions like, is jazz dead? Is jazz dying? Well, the concept of it is being put to sleep because the individualism is being stripped out of it so much. And,
Why is that, Stacy?
Business changes, everything. It's a culture to the music. It's a culture to business. It's a culture to the mixture, and not all of them are understanding each other fully. Because I know the musician is not fully understood being one, in the club. And that's okay, because I understand that a club owner has to make his money. He has to do what he has to do. He has to cater to his or her clientele. I understand that, and that's cool. But that's taking an effect on the music itself, because you don't have we were talking about this earlier about the bands that got to play together and really gel. You don't have those opportunities anymore because of the way the business is. Records, you get a kid that's recording a record, and the label puts people around him that he really doesn't know, hadn't had a chance to connect with, and those kind of things, they hurt it. But as far as making a splash, I don't think you can do that either. Not nowadays, because there's been so much done. And there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, period.
Howard has something to say about the business.
I don't agree with that. I do think that a splash can be made, but the pond right now is very small. And the pond in 1959 was not so small. Jazz was the music of intellectual urbanites. And now it's the music of guys like us, I guess, and I hope people like you, but it's just not part of the national discourse. I mean, in the 50s, Esquire, Playboy had jazz polls, there were articles in those publications frequently about jazz-related things. And we're very lucky to live in New York City and have access to the Times, which has 2, 3, maybe 5 very good jazz writers. So, it's part of the natural discourse here. But I'm in contact with jazz journalists all around the country, and there's no platform typically in publications.
In fact, Howard, it's almost amazing that there is a Jazz Journalists Association. Where do your members, what are their outlets?
Well, there are still some freelance gigs available. A lot of people are blogging. I myself blog. I also write for Downbeat. I write internationally. I write for The Wire. But I used to do much more of that. Liner notes are something that people continue to be able to do, although with record companies also disappearing and not giving so much resources to their packaging. That is a dangerous, endangered species, also the liner note. Many of the jazz journalists also do some teaching. There are radio people. That's an important journalistic element. I mean, it's not considered the same as writing criticism, but we accept photographers also and broadcasters as journalists, and we're trying to look at it as media, people who are talking about using media to talk about jazz, to keep the buzz about this music going, to disseminate the information, to see that there is some documentation of it, and to have the conversation, a public conversation, so that there will be a public that is interested in this, and it's not just our niche, that is around these musicians. We happen to hear these musicians. So we have about 300 members. We have it's an international organization, but mostly in the U.S. and Canada. But most of our work now is online, and so that's a big transition. And that transition is also clear in the music itself. I went to an avant-garde concert about 3 weeks ago in Stony Brook. A composer named Sarah Weaver conducting what she calls telematic music. It was a live improvisation between musicians in Stony Brook and in Palo Alto at Stanford. And so she's done this also with musicians
Were
in
they
South Africa.
Skyping?
They had visuals and they could hear. So the auditory experience was unified. They could see each other through video. They had their own conductor. And it was kind of a wild project, and maybe you'd be shocked by it. I mean, I was not shocked.
Did you like what you heard? Did it sound good?
It was interesting. I held with it. I don't need to like everything. I need to be engaged with everything. I don't want to be bored. I don't want to hear things that I've heard already and that somebody says this is the newest thing, and I go, yeah, I've heard that about a million times. So I'm interested to see things unfold. And this is one of the things too. If you don't like music, you should live with it for a while. I tell my students, if you don't like it, keep listening until you know what it is you don't like about it. I don't want to hear you say, I just didn't like that. So why didn't you
Good
like
advice.
Organ Monk?
I know I have to listen again to figure out why. Too much organ?
Well,
David, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, Karen, you actually brought up a question early on that I'd like to address, which is what was the significance of the Five Spot in 1959, and I'm a Canadian, so just about everyone else here are Americans. So please tell me if I'm full of it. But 1959 is an interesting era. I should have put this out as the one-word thing: post-war. And what was happening in post-war New York City, and I'm saying this because I'm also studying the visual arts a little bit in that time for my current work, is that New York and New Yorkers were starting to see themselves as the center of the Western world artistic community. All of a sudden, it was not Europe, it was not Paris. All of a sudden, New York was the center of the world as far as the arts went.
We forget that there was a time when that wasn't true.
And so if you were...
It's a great point.
No, it wasn't all. It was a big realization. And I'm reading about critics at that time and artists at that time saying, can it be that I'm really, really important? Can it be that I'm really, really original? And there were so many really interesting streams coming through that at the time, which is one reason I said Western, because there's so much politics in New York City. I think.
Yes.
Maybe I'm wrong.
You're right.
I'm just a Canadian, what do I know?
You're right.
But of course, when Jackson Pollock became very famous, one thing that could be said on his behalf was that he was from the West. He was actually from Utah or someplace, I think. So he could be said, this guy's original, he's outside of the politics, he came from the West, he's rough-hewn, he's a drunk, he just does this stuff kind of naturally the way the cowboys are supposed to do it. And if you look at some of the early criticism of or descriptions of Coleman too, he came from Texas via Los Angeles. He also was from the West. Therefore, he was from the heartland. He was natural.
He was allowed to be
He was like
real
a real
and free.
American. He was the gunslinger who came into town and straightened things out. There was a lot of that kind of mythos there that kind of played into this is real American art being made here. So there's all sorts of those sorts of currents of force and influence coming into play when you see that. And I think in that period, if you go back, Huntley and Brinkley came and interviewed Ornette. He was the center of attention. He was the hippest thing going on, according to the media, and more power to him, in artistic terms. But if you were coming through New York from that time, from anywhere in the world, the hippest place you could go was the Five Spot Café. There was a huge confluence of power there.
Well, that's a great point, and because it was true then and it's true now that musicians come here to make it, writers come here to make it, actors come here to make it, and if you try to stay where you are and make it, that will be probably limiting, unless it's Hollywood or Nashville. But what do you think, Howard?
I think this is changing. I don't see how the city can support artists right now. The housing problem is just not. I live in distant Brooklyn now, and I'm about to move to Chicago because we just could not find real estate that we could afford at all. And I have a lot of friends who live in Brooklyn. It's difficult for them to get together to rehearse, because they're scattered. Like some of them are in Greenpoint, some of them are in Kensington, and some of them are down in Coney Island. And this is not like a neighborhood as the East Village used to be, where people would run into each other on the street. This has changed a lot. I think also the internet makes it more possible to be many different places. It's not only that, and I haven't studied this as specifically as David, but what was happening in the late 50s was that media was becoming more centralized in New York City. It wasn't just that New Yorkers were waking up and thinking this is the center of the universe. Harold Ross had said that when he started the New Yorker in the late 20s. People thought it through the 30s. This is where the plays were. That was the center of the universe. I think for the abstract expressionists in the visual art world. But what really changed was that Chicago lost its network television. Network television became concentrated here, not in L.A. Ornette could not get arrested in L.A., or he could get arrested. That was about all he could get.
Apparently, he cleared out the clubs where he played. Everybody left, according to
The
David's
musicians didn't
book.
want to hear him. He had nothing to do with the studio work. They thought he was a total freak. He had to get out of there basically for his own safety as much as, to be introduced to an audience that would really dig him. But I don't think it's true anymore that you can only, and in fact, I think that for our culture, it's essential that we decentralize at this point.
Yeah, it seems like Detroit is a great place to go, honestly. But Stacy, what do you think? As actually, I was a Michiganer. There's a reason you came here.
It's true what you say about the internet and everything. Because you can, you got the technology to record an entire album wherever you are, with just contents in a backpack, so we've gotten to that. But the one thing you got to remember is that people still view New York City as the place to come. They still do. So if you really want to test your mettle and you really want to, it's an energy here that you're not going to find anywhere else.
This is true.
And this is true today.
This is true.
Even though it's not like it used to be. It's not like it was 10 years ago when around the time when I first got here. But the fact that this is still where the best of the best still, they come here and they gather here, whether they come for 10 days, whether they come for 10 months, 10 years, find a way to make it happen. Like I live in a 5-bedroom house, you know, in Flatbush. And lucky for us, I mean, it's hard to get together and rehearse. We're one of the fortunate bunch because we have space in our place where we could do that. But it's not the case in a norm for everybody.
Stacy, do you know anyone who's left, who said, I can't afford it, I'm going back home, I'm leaving, whatever?
Plenty of people. I mean, plenty. But also plenty of stayed. Yeah. Stuck it out.
Well, I mean, I think David Murray was a huge influence in the 1980s here in New York City. Enormous. He's living in Paris. Steve Coleman was probably the most influential jazz musician in the early 90s, and had a whole M-Bass collective, in Brooklyn, in Fort Greene. He's left. He's living out in Scranton. Cassandra Wilson was part of that. She's living in Mississippi. I mean, people are. Osby was from Philly. He moved back to Philly. It's very difficult to keep it going here right now. With the clubs closing, with the record companies all but disappeared, it's just difficult.
Well,
And,
let's talk about the clubs.
It's good for the schools.
Right.
It's good to come and to run into everybody. And I think you're right. You've got to test your mettle here. If you're a jazz musician, you must come here, and you've got to keep cracking your head against it. I think that's true. There are people who don't do that, who are very good, who are outside New York. They still come here and do their auditions for grant applications and things like that from time to time. That's a way to go. But it's just sad what's happened in the city because of the influx of huge amounts of money.
And not necessarily saying that you have to move here. I mean, not saying that you can't be successful, whether it's musically or financially, if you don't come here. I'm not saying that. But, if the art is what really drives you, if it's what really moves you, then you will make that trip, Because some musicians don't really do it for, the right reason, as a musician would say.
Stacy, do you feel that it does pay off creatively to come here and work with the other musicians and feel the energy, et cetera? Is it worth it?
Definitely. I've grown leaps and bounds since being here. I mean, as a person and as a musician, they kind of go hand in hand. You take one lesson from this and apply it to the other, vice versa.
I think because there's energy, which is very important, but there's also synergy. There's what happens when you bring certain people together, and talk about the early Ornette Coleman Quartet with Charlie Hayden and Don Cherry and Billy Higgins. I mean, who was the non-brilliant person in that band, or Ed Blackwell? But what was it that made those people get together and make that music at that time? Because we're talking about energy, we're talking about communities, and communities can be made in all sorts of configurations from all sorts of individuals at any time. I mean, in Chicago, the ACM was happening. In the 60s, again, a very small nucleus of people came together and said to other musicians, you can do this. You have the permission to do this. I have been there, and you can go there too. This synergy can happen in different places in different times, and there's communities all over the place. And in fact, I talk a little bit about the role of media in this, and there's been a whole community for decades in Los Angeles, which has not gotten much. The Horace Tapscott nucleus, which again was a very strong community force. Which it kind of depends if someone comes and does that thing of consecration and says, this is special, but it can be special without that consecration, and whether that consecration comes from major record companies, major critics, major scholars, influential musicians, which is what I write about Five Spot, or if it comes from Oprah. It still is a kind of consecration that might not have anything to do with the actual incredible energy and synergy that people can make together. And and out of the Coleman example, communities sprang up all over the world. And we can say it's an individual musician. I write a fair amount about Evan Parker, the incredible saxophone player from England, but he came from a very small community of players in London at that time who took the ball and ran with it in their direction, and there were communities throughout Europe as well who took that example and said, you can make music from this nucleus and you can build it into anything you want, and that community energy still exists all over and still can blossom anywhere. But I still don't know if that idea of an avant-garde explosion can occur anymore, because we're in a bit of a postmodern era, I guess.
Right. We've had a lot of avant-garde. Before we're going to turn to questions and answers soon, if you all have some thoughts and some questions. But I'd like to end on a more optimistic note, and it seems to me that there absolutely are communities, in this incredible creative city that we have. And one part of Stacy's experience that I was particularly interested in is his involvement in the club called Smalls, which strikes me as very much a community kind of place, and maybe other clubs are too. But tell us about that community.
It's the place where, it's a lot of, I'm definitely a regular there. It's a bunch of regulars. They're all great musicians, and everybody have a mutual respect for each other, a common thing that we all strive for and everything. All different kinds of people, different kinds of, different backgrounds and everything like that. If any place had, like the legacy of a Five Spot, or, it'll be places like Smalls, because you don't have to pay $35, $45 to get in there. So you're not alienating anybody. They cut a deal with musicians that want to come in, just listen and play a little bit. They might not have that much money. You can come on in. Or you got the people that are the big spenders. They come on in there too. So it's a nice blend of everything.
And you've said that the owners are musicians, and that really changes the atmosphere. Right,
and a club is only as hip as its owner. So, when you got hip owners, then you got a hip club, You got people that care about the music, they're going to care about the music. You got people that only care about profit, they're only going to care about profit. And they're going to do what they have to do to make the music, make the profit, which is, which kind of goes back to the comment I made about not believing that another splash is going to happen, because there's so many grips on the artistic ride that you take, because we got to think about so much. You got to think about the venues that you play in, and you got to they tell you who
website.
To bring. Yeah, right. They tell you who to bring. They tell you got to play quiet. You got to play like this. You record a record. You got to keep it short because we want to put it on the radio. It's like all these things that stunt your artistic drive. You know what I mean? But a place like Smalls, I've noticed a difference, because I've played in some of the bigger clubs before with a band, and then we'll leave and go, the same band, we'll go to Smalls and hang out afterwards, and we'll take the stage. And then afterwards, it's like, whoa, night and day. The energy, why didn't you play like that earlier? So it's because, well, we really couldn't. We really didn't know. I understand. So that was the case. But, Smalls is, Fat Cat is another place.
Which is only $3 to get in.
Only $3 to get in, but it's, it's 75 Christopher Street at 7th Avenue South.
Now, Howard gets out to some obscure places in Brooklyn.
Well, Shapeshifter Lab is the most interesting place in Brooklyn so far that I've been at. And it's in a very obscure part of, I thought, Brooklyn. I mean, I've gone there probably half a dozen times. I still can't really find my way. Every time I go there, I get lost. It's around Union Street and 3rd Avenue in Gowanus. There are a number of places in Gowanus. I was at a place called Douglas Street Collective last week, which is just a little rehearsal room in a artistic, collaborative garage, I guess, that they've renovated. I-Beam is another one, like you're saying. There's a very nice place called Brick, BRIC, which is just off Flatbush in Fort Greene. And I heard Cassandra with Melvin Gibbs, Brandon Ross, and J.T. Lewis. What do they call it? Named for the woman who ran the Underground Railroad.
Harriet Tubman.
Yeah, the Harriet Tubman Trio. So, and they had a huge crowd. I was amazed when I went in. It's a very modern place, and that's a nice venue. It's part of that Brooklyn Academy of Music neighborhood thing. But that's well worth looking into. I don't know what kind of booking they're doing, though. These are not jazz clubs. These are like standing, well, Shapeshifter is a jazz club. It's run by a jazz musician named Matt Garrison, Jimmy Garrison's son. Jimmy Garrison was the great bass player who worked with Ornette, who worked with John Coltrane, who's best known. And Shapeshifter, I mean, and the cool thing about that, and also Smalls, is how they're using media to get the information out. Because Smalls, at least for a while, I don't know if they're still doing this, was streaming video. That's still going on. And similarly, Garrison at Shapeshifter has a huge media installation. And I don't think he's streaming, but I think he's doing a lot of videotaping there. And I'm sure we're going to end up seeing that in some sort of way.
Great. Thank you. Well, we've thrown a lot out here. We've talked about the avant-garde and the Five Spot and clubs today and critics and business. And we're wondering what questions you all have. We've got Nora and Aaron will bring you a microphone. And let's see, Aaron, why don't we go? Is that Jane? That's not Jane. Yeah, this lady here. So please say your name and ask a question.
My name is Mary Jenkins. I live here in the village.
I can hear, so I'll repeat the question.
Anyway, I wondered if any of you remember John Garcia Gensel, who was pastor to the Jazz Community.
Sure.
In St. Peter's Lutheran Church. Now there's a free venue, and they're still going, even though Pastor Gensel has passed on. I've heard wonderful musicians there, Howard McGee, Joe Newman, Billy Taylor, Carmen McRae, Eddie Bonnemere. I mean, these people were amazing and creative and wrote their own stuff. And he started All Night Soul. And, once a year they play all night long. So it was great. So,
Great, thank you. Say the name of the church again.
St. Peter's Lutheran.
Okay. Any comment on St. Peter's Lutheran?
Well, they are an important venue still. I mean, they're doing a lot of jazz at noon performances and businessman's jam sessions. And it's the place where many of the memorial services for deceased jazz musicians take place too. So they've been staunch. They're really a wonderful community service. Not so much a showcase for the avant-garde. I mean, it's not some place where younger musicians go to perform, but so what?
They used to get, I don't know nowadays, but
They used to get avant-garde players. Just walking around town, I notice a lot of churches advertising jazz vespers, which somehow I can never stop and go into, but that certainly seems to be ongoing.
And you have an audience that's listening.
That's right, a captive audience. So another question. Thank you for that.
My voice carries.
Why don't we get Aaron to bring you the microphone? If you would say your name and state your question.
Yes, my name is Edith Penty, and would you talk about the jazz scene in Europe and Japan today?
Well, that's a big question. Anything more? You're just wondering what's happening in Europe and Japan?
Yes, because from what I understand, things are happening in Japan, Tokyo, and it's not a dying art.
Right, not at all. And Japan saved our American musicians, didn't it? To some extent.
Well, the economic situation has hampered that a large degree also, though, as I understand it. Most of the musicians who I'm in contact with who are Stacy's age, say, or a little bit older, are disappointed that foreign tours have been cut way back. And certainly in Japan, has had economic problems for the last 15 years or so. There is still active listening going on there, but the days when Ron Carter was a star of advertising on Japanese TV, that seems to have ended. We used to see a lot of Japanese musicians coming over. We still are seeing some of that coming here. I know of 3 or 4 pianists, but I don't hear about people going out. Like Art Blakey, that was a regular stop for him, but this is 30 years ago now. Europe also, I think, has seen a lot of cutback, unfortunately. There's a lot of good music being created in Europe, and the booking agents are happy to have good European musicians playing at European venues.
And there are large and popular festivals, aren't there, in all over Europe for jazz? Any thoughts, David? You're practically in Europe, aren't you?
No. The question doesn't really interest me very much. I mean, I think we should actually concentrate on contemplating things like the idea that jazz is actually in an early stage. That in reality, the notion of improvising and the notion of combining that with composition and the ways that has emerged in so many ways in African American culture and has gone through cultures throughout the world, we're only beginning to understand how it works. And as I was talking about before, we're not even talking about jazz as philosophy and improvisation as philosophy. And we're not even talking about how it's an identity creation that you make when you play music. You're talking about something. You're thinking in the music as well. You're not having musical thoughts and writing them down and then playing them afterwards. It's happening right there. It's identity creation and it's improvisation, and it's happening there in the music. And through the different improvising communities that I think have emerged, not only through the jazz that came before Ornette Coleman, but the jazz that came after them, I think there's many templates for human behavior, for new ways of thinking, for new ways of configuring social communities. This interests me way more. And these are really big questions, and it came out of the whole, it kind of can be seen come into a focus, like the storm's focus on a tornado at some point. If there's a tornado, there's a lot of activity in the sky above it. The Five Spot was one of those places where that tornado touched down, and those winds are still blowing all over the place. And I'm not even sure we've even started to understand and been able to articulate the many ways in which music is a philosophy and the many ways that we can shape our ideas of who we are through music.
That's terrific. Thank you. That's a lot of food for thought. Another question. Thank you, David. Yeah.
I have a question. My name is Charles Gerson. I've heard that jazz schools are still very popular with young people. They're going to jazz schools by the hundreds, but jazz is not doing so well. How do you explain that?
Well, I'll point out that we're about to hear from some jazz students, and the new school for jazz and contemporary music, I think, is pretty well populated. So you're saying there don't seem to be that many students, or there aren't a whole lot of jobs for anything, really. I don't know. Yeah.
You try it.
Well, when you say doing not so good, you could say that in an artistic sense or in a money sense. But I would say one thing about the school, because I went to undergrad in Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio, and I learned a lot of good things. But the one thing that was left out is pretty much exactly what David was talking about, the philosophy of the music, you know. And because of the past, the way business has been shaped out and everything, and you got to remember that the school came after the craft, you know. It had to. And what people were failing to do is, you know, is learn how they really learn. Not just learn their notes, not just learn their patterns, not just learn their compositions, but get into their head, get into their psyche, understand why they did this. Any music, any really rich cultural music that you will find all over the world is usually really tied close to the people that's doing it. How many instances are you gonna know the black experience really, you know, and then go from there with the music, you know, because if you go to Cuba and you learn some Cuban music, you're gonna learn some Cuban culture too. You believe that, and you know, it's like that part is sidestepped, and that's the problem, because you can't forget what made this so. We listen to Live at the Spot, Five Spot, Thelonious Monk. We listen to Kind of Blue, Love Supreme. We listen to these records today like they're brand new, brand new. You listen to a record that was released 3 years ago and you forget about it. You listen to a record that was out 8 years ago and you totally forgot about it because of what's being put into it. You know, you leave that philosophical part has to be included. That cultural recognition, it has to be included, and that's what you're seeing. You know, you seeing the result of groups not being able to spend a lot of time together to work out a thing, and you seeing a lot of groups getting together that are working out a thing. It's not based on the same things that made the music popular and powerful in the first place.
It gets back to the spirituality that you started out talking about, David, it seems to me, you know, to...
I was on a panel with a local New York bass player. I was up in Guelph, a guy named William Parker, last year up in Guelph. And everyone was talking about improvisation, and it got around to William, and William said, and William is now, I think of him as a young guy like me, but he's been in the scene for a long time. And he said when he started playing, I think, in New York in the early 70s. He said, until I went to Europe with Cecil Taylor, William said, nobody talked about improvisation. We talked about playing. And that's what one did. And it struck me that there's so much embedded knowledge and understanding and mutuality and cultural layers in the fact that, as William was saying, in a very understated way, we just played. That's such a socially loaded comment. There was so much understanding in musicians getting together and just playing, and so much shared history and so much shared intention that
they could just play and not intellectualize it about improvising or what have you.
I don't know. I think it is very intellectual. It's really hard work and takes a lot of knowledge, but there's just so many levels that aren't really discussed because they're difficult to understand. They're difficult to comprehend in actually spoken or written language. But if you're there, you can then understand it. You know, you can understand it when you're playing.
Well, let's briefly,
but I think
we'll
it is
see if there's
intellectual.
another question.
It is really intellectual. And it's a little bit what I was talking about before about playing with your body and thinking with your body. I think there's levels of intellect we get into through music that we don't even talk about.
And Howard, I have to interrupt for a moment because David, that our conductor who we're going to experience in a moment, Jane Ira Bloom, is a pioneer in movement in jazz. So anyway, by the way, speaking of movement, and Howard, you were going to say?
I was just going to say, I think I agree with what Stacy was saying about this also, that those students, it's great when you get out of school, but to be a jazz musician, you're talking about a lifelong discipline. Mm-hmm. And if these students have not lived a jazz life, if they have not been hustling for gigs, if they've not been learning from their peers and their elders, if they're not steeped in the culture naturally, then it's going to take them some time before they become real jazz musicians. You know, they have to live with that. And we're not going to see the benefits of that explosion of jazz education, I would say, for another 10, 15 years. We're seeing some of it. I had lunch today with the executive director of the jazz program here, and he said that he was troubled because many of the students, once they leave the school, no longer identify themselves with jazz. And I said, what do they identify themselves with? He says, almost any other genre. Indie, alt-rock, whatever, you know, or improvisational music with a compositional edge. But, you know, that the jazz term itself is problematic. And frankly, I think that there's a financial problem for students getting, I mean, you know, you graduate from school, what do you want to do? Oh, I'm going to become a jazz musician. And are you going to go on welfare also, or what? I mean, it's darn hard, you know. So for somebody to learn how to deal with that, that's something which the financial element is not usually taught in the schools either, and it's a challenge.
Yeah.
There's a woman who's
Actually,
had her
Howard,
hand up over there.
Make it quick. Yeah, we would love to.
Thank you all. I'd like to ask Stacy Dillard, for those of us here who haven't been able to meet Ornette Coleman in his house and play with him, can you tell us a little more about what that was like? Thank you.
The question was, what was it like to play with Ornette?
Well, it started off, I remember we all gathered in this place in the 30s, like West 36th Street or something like that. Well, I don't want to give you his address now. You're knocking on his door. Anyway. Yeah, right? So we're in there, and you know, it's the five of us. We're sitting in the room, and everybody's kind of not really knowing what to do, not knowing what to say.
What were the instruments present, Stacy?
I was playing tenor sax. He was playing alto, of course. Spike Wilner was playing piano. Joseph Lepore was playing bass, and Anthony Pinciotti was playing drums. And it was about 3 o'clock. We played for a couple hours. It was about 3 o'clock. So then
3 o'clock in the morning.
Oh no, I wish. I wish it were 3 in the morning. That, you know, that's a good hour to just play. It really is. You should try it. So we all gather, and he's sitting there, and like the first thing he says is, well, he only said one thing. He said, so looking around at everybody, he's like, so what's the hardest key to play in? And then they got quiet, and it's like, well, they can all be hard, you know. And then he was like, that's a good answer. Then he just started. And we played for like 2 hours. I mean, when I say straight, I mean 2 hours straight. By the time everybody was like, ugh. Okay, oh, it's 5:15. Ooh, okay, let's have a drink of water. And then we would just talk about things, and he would just have these little quotes and phrases. I can't recall any of them right off the top.
This is a problem. People can never remember what he said.
Yeah.
It is odd.
You can actually find some good stuff online, though,
in my
of
book.
him. Yeah, yeah.
You know, if you don't mind me saying so.
Unfortunately, or fortunately, we actually have to wrap it up a bit because we have a treat to hear the Ornette Coleman Ensemble, and we're going to turn it over to them. And we can, if you have more questions, we're all going to be here. We're going to have a book signing so we can talk some more. And I just want to see if a special guest showed up. Is Larry Finn here? Here he is. Larry, would you stand, and do you want to, if you would give the microphone. Larry is the son-in-law of Joe Termini. Joe and Iggy owned the Five Spot, and I was so delighted to just hear
Thank you.
from
Thank
one
you.
of
Thank you for the kind things.
his sister-in-law finally emailed me. Talk to us, Larry.
I'm sorry?
I said, talk to us. Apparently, you're the keeper of all things Five Spot.
Well, there's a couple of things that you said that I've been told slightly different. The part about Larry Rivers claiming to be the one to introduce avant-garde, or actually, you know, jazz
Talk in. Right in. Yeah.
to the Five Spot. And the way I was told, it was there was a fellow that lived above the bar. The bar was on the edge of the Bowery, and it was a neighborhood bar. And about every 30 to 40 minutes, there were painters that lived above they would come down to buy beer. And they said, you know, Joe, if you put music in here, we'd stay here and drink instead of taking the beer upstairs. And so one thing led to another, and that's the way it was told to me. But my father-in-law was not a fan of Mr. Rivers. But the other thing was, it was the painters that brought the music, to the bar. They lived in the neighborhood because rents were cheap. They needed big spaces for the canvases, and that was the music they liked, and that's what they wanted to hear. And one thing, it was very organic. It evolved, and we've spent a lot of time in the 90s, my father-in-law and I and my wife and my mother-in-law. We'd have them over for dinner every Sunday, and he liked to ramble and tell stories, and most of them I've been able to remember, and one of these days I should put them to print or onto disc and share with all of you. But
well, thank you, Larry. I'm so
You're
glad
welcome.
you're here, and hopefully we'll get to chat with you more afterward.
yes, thank you.
So, thank you. And now, let's enjoy the Ornette Coleman Ensemble. Thanks very much to the Ornette Coleman Ensemble.